On May 5, a 16-year-old girl, Marfa Goloviznina, from Nuk, was on her way to her grandmother's in Chulia. She chose a shortcut through the gloomy and grim swamps. In the forest, a narrow path winds among the bushes and bogs, in some places covered by short logs like a primitive walkway. Between them, you immediately sink into knee-deep mud. The puddles are black as tar, sometimes with a rusty film, as if there's blood among the swamps. The girl saw a man lying face down on the path, wearing bas shoes and a kaftan with a bundle on his head. The edge of his clothing was thrown over him, and it turned out the man was simply asleep. The girl took him for a drunkard and walked on, but when she returned the same way on May 6th, everything was different. The body was lying in the same place, but now someone had removed the kaftan, and it was clear that the person had no head. There was a gaping wound on the neck. Marfa ran home in panic, and her father reported it to the authorities. This happened in 1892. Today we have an unusual case with an unexpected plot twist, a literally prehistoric true crime. Compare how it was before and how it is now. April 1892, Russian Empire, the village of Stary Moltan. A Russian boy went to play at the house of his Udmurt friend and overheard the adults discussing the recent natural disasters in the province. Either they didn't notice the child sitting behind the stove, or they didn't know that the boy understood. The Udmurt guest overheard a very strange and creepy conversation. One of the adults was telling that he had a dream in which many people fell into a terrible abyss. The frightened people promised God to make any sacrifice for their salvation, and then a path appeared before them, leading out of the abyss up to the light and abundance. The Udmurts in the hut believed the dream showed God was displeased and sending disasters due to weak faith. And that means they needed to hold a prayer ceremony with the proper ritual sacrifice, and since God was so displeased, they shouldn't spare the ritual blood. In the early 1890s, disaster struck the Viatka province. First a poor harvest, then a typhus epidemic. The situation was difficult, but the village of Stary Multan was almost unaffected. There was no typhus at all, and only a few families suffered from hunger. In the village, mostly Udmurts lived there. Back then, they were called Vatikis, while the neighboring villages of Anek and Chulia were mostly Russian. The situation there was difficult. People who weren't starving were desperately looking for someone to blame and quarreled with the Udmurts over land that had miraculously escaped crop failure and epidemic. And on May 6, a girl named Marfa found a headless corpse. The police officer reached the body on May 8 and the bailiff on May 10. All this time, the body was not guarded. The examination showed that the head was separated while the person was still alive, a blood clot was stuck in the trachea, and the victim's shoes were clean, which indicated that he did not come here by himself, he was brought here. There was neither the head nor any blood near the body. They found a certificate with the name Konan Dmitrievich Matyunin, a peasant from Kazan province, in the bag. For some reason, Officer Timofeev did not leave the body in the village of Anik, but ordered it to be taken to Stary Multan, to the Udmurts. This caused confusion, because technically the body was found in the territory of Anik, but the explanation was that the Udmurts themselves approached the officer and tried to show him the blood traces at the scene, but he regarded their behavior with suspicion. Perhaps he was influenced by the Russian peasants' talk that the Udmurts had preserved the custom of silencing a person, of sacrificing people to the gods. The investigator ignored the dead man's strange clothing while the girl walked along the path. On May 5, the body was found face down with a kaftan draped over it, as if the person or someone else had covered him. The face was hidden after death. She assumed it was a drunk man sleeping in the forest. The next day, on May 6, she went back the same way. The body was still there, but now the kaftan was gone. It turns out someone approached the dead man, examined him, maybe touched him, maybe searched his pockets. Who did it remains a mystery. The police didn't send anyone there during that time. The girl finally told the adults that there was a decapitated man lying on the trail. While waiting for the police officer, peasants from both villages trampled the area, leaving no tracks. It was impossible to tell if the body had been dragged where it came from, or if he was killed here or brought later. When the police officer arrived at the scene, the body was still lying in the same place, but the kaftan was no longer on the body. It had been neatly folded by him and placed behind the straps of his knapsack. Someone, even after the girl had left and after the peasant had trampled around, had come up to the body again. What were they doing? Turning it over, hiding something. Why did they touch the dead man again? Then, a couple of days later, the district officer arrived and found changes again. Now the kaftan had been put back on. It wasn't just thrown over him. His arms went through the sleeves and the bag was placed on top. It was as if someone had dressed the dead man like he was alive. The bath shoes were also tied but poorly, as if they had been put on cold, limp feet. There were no Udmurts in the area at that time. None of the locals claimed to have come near. So it turns out that while the body was lying on the path, someone kept coming back to it over and over, taking off the kaftan, putting it behind the bag, then taking it out again and putting it back on the dead man. All of this without any explanation. Why this was done, to confuse the investigation or hide their actions, was unclear, especially since the bailiff and investigators paid little attention to it. Only the poorly tied bast shoes caught their attention. But the fact that someone had changed the body's clothes, moved it, and returned to it several times was left aside, even though that could have held the key to the mystery. In the end, the body was brought to Stari Multan, where the locals dug a pit and threw in ice and snow. The deceased was wrapped in a mat and covered with earth, with guards posted nearby. That's what passed for a morgue refrigerator in those days. But in May, it was hard to preserve a body without a refrigerator. The locals complained about the smell. The body was dug up and reburied several times. Boards were laid to avoid damage, but then one of the boards collapsed. Conan Matyunin's body lay in a pit with ice for almost a month. Due to the epidemic, all doctors were busy, so no one could be sent for the examination. When the doctor arrived and performed the autopsy, everyone gasped. The head had been removed while the heart was still beating, and a blood clot, like a cork, was lodged in the throat. But that wasn't all. The chest was also cut deeply, with force, and it immediately became clear that this was much more terrifying than just a beheading. The chest had been chopped with an axe or something similar. It couldn't have been done with a single blow. They hacked at the ribs, the collarbone, and the dense back muscles. The weapon marks were confident and precise, as if the person knew exactly where to strike. But the most horrifying part was that inside it was empty. No heart, no lungs. They weren't just damaged, they were carefully removed, skillfully, as if someone deliberately spread the edges of the wound, took out everything they needed, and then closed it up again. Even the shirt was in place. If the body had already stiffened by that time, the edges wouldn't have closed back up. That means the organs were removed soon after the attack, at most within 10 to 12 hours. So, someone acted quickly and precisely, and clearly not hastily in the forest, but somewhere secluded where no one would interfere. Why did they take out the heart, and why wasn't the head found? Back then, everyone decided it wasn't just an attack, but a sacrifice supposedly according to some ancient pagan ritual, but no one looked for any evidence. From the very beginning, they decided that the Udmurts tortured a Russian. Meanwhile, law enforcement started an investigation. One of the interrogations was conducted with 90-year-old Andrei Grigoriev. He was paralyzed and said that he never left his house. He was never a shaman and never engaged in any rituals. There really were so-called clan huts in the village where the Udmurts made offerings to the spirits of their ancestors. In Stari Multan there were 2 such huts for different clans. In each of them they found dishes with traces of blood, feathers and fur in both huts. Christian icons stood in a place of honor, and the police confiscated the dishes from the clan huts, bowls, basins and dishes with dried blood and bird feathers. Although in fact, it didn't really prove anything. You could find things like that in any peasant household. All of this was added to the case as evidence, and later the dishes were presented in court. To confirm that it was human blood in the bowls, someone recalled a folk method. If a dog doesn't lick it, then it's human. Naturally, the dog refused to lick the 5-month-old dried blood. The veterinarians and doctors said this method is unscientific and proves nothing. But the investigation continued to believe in the dog's squeamishness as proof, declaring all the items to be sacrificial utensils. However, the examination showed that the blood was of animal origin and the hair was pet fur. Despite this, the items were kept among the evidence to be shown to the jury at the trial. These pieces of evidence had no legal force, but they could make the desired impression. By this time, several residents of Old Multan had already been arrested. Moisey Dmitriev, the owner of one of the huts, 90-year-old Andrei Grigoriev, Semyon Krasnov, also known as Ivanov, Vasily Kondratiev, and the butcher Kuzma Samsonov, who was considered the executioner as he often slaughtered cattle. The investigators assumed that he could have also taken Matyunin's life. There was no evidence, but suspicions were enough. Oddly, Dmitriev's wife, who reportedly helped move the body, was not questioned. Before arresting Dmitriev, the police interrogated two local madmen, Mikhail Titov and Konstantin Moiseyev. They were put in a basement, intimidated, beaten, and they managed to get testimony from Moiseyev. He remembered how the village head, Semyon Krasny, once led some vagabond through the village. That man supposedly stopped at the daily duty officer Kondratiev. That was enough to arrest both Krasnov and Kondratiev, and Titov in turn gave up his nephew. They said he treats people with herbs, which means he's a shaman and therefore dangerous. After that, both fools were released. They had played their roles in parallel. They were examining Dmitriev's dishes and clothes. There were brown stains on his bag, but it was only later discovered that it was berry juice, not blood. But even after that, Moisey Dmitriev remained under arrest. The investigators did not want to admit their mistake. Instead, they conducted another search in the hut, collected more dishes with traces of old blood, and once again added all of this to the case. Time passed, but there was no evidence. Then the police decided to use undercover agents. They placed local Udmurts with the prisoners to eavesdrop on a confession, but they didn't learn anything new. Even so, the police, and in the Russian Empire, by the way, the police were actually called the police, kept insisting, there is a case, there is a crime, there are suspects, here they are. Meanwhile, the village's local police officer was replaced. The new constable was terrifying and behaved differently. He didn't make any sudden moves and acted friendly, but this friendliness turned out to be only on the surface. One day, he asked the wealthy peasant Vasily Kuznetsov for a loan of 10 rubles. A respected man is asking for a small amount for a uniform. How could you refuse? A few days later, the policeman asked Vasily to lend him 15 rubles again. The peasant, surprised, said, "But you haven't returned the 10 rubles yet?" and quickly appeared suspicious. The offended policeman remembered that Kuznetsov was on night duty on May 4th, which automatically made him a potential witness or participant. Kuznetsov was arrested. Remarkably, he was not only Russian but also led the Orthodox community, making it odd to see him accused of participating in a pagan ritual. The local priest, who had known Kuznetsov for years, was shocked. He went to Zhukov and tried to explain that the Udmurts had been Christians for a long time, that the rumors were just prejudice, and that no one had ever seen any human sacrifices. But the priest wasn't even officially questioned because of these doubts about the police methods. The priest lost his position, and a new priest was sent to the village, young and obedient to the authorities. He saw nothing criminal in the Udmurt festivities by the forest, but still gave investigators the detail they needed. Among the dancers was an elderly woman, Kuznetsov's mother. That was enough to accuse her son of insincerity in his faith. The investigation continued to build its own version. According to it, this is how everything happened. On the night of May 4th to 5th, 1892, Vasily Kuznetsov met the beggar Konan Matyunin on the outskirts of the village. He took him to the village where the other suspects were. They fed the poor man, gave him vodka, and let him spend the night. Moisey Dmitriev was informed that a suitable vagrant for the ritual had come to the village, and he organized the sacrifice. Then another person got involved in the case, Mikhail Kobilin. He lived in Stary Moltan and quickly found common ground with the new policeman, Zhukov. Soon he began telling scary stories. Supposedly, the Udmurts sacrifice a foal every year to the evil house spirit, Kurbon, and once every 40 years they sacrifice a person, necessarily a non-believer. The heart and lungs are burned and the head is separated. Koberlin claimed that he learned this from some Udmurt vagabond he drank with about 10 years ago. He didn't remember who it was, neither the name nor where he was from. Mikhail Kobilin was made the main witness for the prosecution. Only later it turned out that he had a personal conflict with the residents of Stary Moltan. A year before the incident, he was caught stealing grain. Kobilin secretly kept part of the communal supplies for himself. And when the Udmurts complained to the authorities, he was forced to return everything and cover up the matter as a mistake. But his relationship with the neighbors was ruined forever. The investigators, however, decided to ignore this conflict. Moreover, they began actively questioning the neighboring villages to reconstruct Matyunin's route. It turned out that he left his native village on April 20 and walked more than 100 kilometers on foot. On May 3, he spent the night in the village of Kuznirka at Timofey Sanikov's place, where he showed his passport and said that he suffered from epilepsy. On the night of May 4 to 5, he most likely also stayed with the Sanikovs, this time at the house of their son Nikolai. And this is where the contradictions began. The elder Sanikov remembered that Matyunin had a large blue patch on his kaftan, but the younger one did not. Investigator Rayevsky, seizing on this discrepancy, put forward a theory. So, there were two different beggars. One was Matyunin, the other was unknown. Stary Multan residents' testimonies varied. Some saw a beggar with a blue patch, others a drunk, and someone with a hand-rolled cigarette. All of this could fit Matyunin's description, but it also might not. The fact is that none of the witnesses could identify him specifically. Everything was based on guesses and coincidences. Konan Matyunin was not just a vagabond, he suffered from epilepsy, and at that time it was considered a sentence. He couldn't work in the field or in the forge, seizures could strike at any moment. That's why in spring and summer he would leave his homeland to wander and beg for alms, like thousands of others who were just as destitute and sick with him. He had a certificate confirming his diagnosis, issued by the county hospital. For people like him, it was something like a disability identification, so that the villagers, seeing a strong, seemingly healthy man, wouldn't look away with suspicion, and with the certificate they would give him a little something. He looked too much like someone who was faking it, not really suffering. The doctors offered him surgery in Kazan. Back then, they still believed that epilepsy could be cured by trepanning the skull. Matyunin refused. He was afraid. He preferred to live with seizures rather than with a hole in his head. He was generally cautious, didn't drink, didn't smoke. After drinking or tobacco, he would have severe seizures. He knew this and was careful. But when they started collecting testimonies in Stary Molten, these facts were ignored. Is that even possible? A vagabond who doesn't drink? Eyewitnesses said that on the evening of May 4th, a drunk beggar with a hand-rolled cigarette was seen in the village, dirty, with a cloudy look in his eyes, barely able to stand. They claimed it was the very same person who was later found dead in the forest. But Conan didn't smoke or drink. He would have had a seizure. It was someone else. Nevertheless, the investigation decided that it was indeed Konan Matyunin who arrived in Multan on May 4. That was enough for them to share and continue insisting on the theory of a ritual killing, although it would have been much more logical to admit that the person simply didn't make it to the village and was killed on the way, for example by a random robber. Moreover, if there really were two similar strangers in the region that night, it wouldn't have been difficult to identify the second one. The province was under quarantine. All roads were guarded, documents were checked, but no one was eager to look for the second one. Instead, the investigation deliberately ignored all the facts that didn't fit the constructed narrative. All efforts were focused on reinforcing the already shaky ritual version. People were accused not based on facts but on assumptions, guesses and rumors, while the accused themselves spent months in prison without knowing exactly what they were being charged with or why. By the fall of 1892, the situation in the case had taken a blatantly absurd turn. The investigation had already accumulated 11 detainees, but there was no direct evidence against any of them. The decisive stage started in October. Investigator for especially important cases, Yelizarov, arrived in Vyatka. He was convinced that he was uncovering not just an attack on a beggar, but a crime connected to remnants of paganism. Yelizarov did not come to seek the truth, but to confirm his hypothesis. Even before analyzing the facts, he took the side of the prosecution. To authorities, the Multan case had already symbolized the struggle between civilization and savagery. It was hard to give up such a beautiful metaphor, so the support for the prosecution came from the top. The main task was not only to prove each arrestee's guilt, but also to confirm his existence. VI. The case was not so much about taking Matyunin's life as it was about the political and cultural context. To prove that in the heart of Russia, in an empire that prided itself on its enlightened governance, there were still people performing pagan rituals. For this reason, the prosecution did everything to portray the Udmurts as exotic and backward, to present evidence that had no legal force. They gathered it to evoke disgust and fear in the jurors. After 2 years of investigations, the first trial in the Moltansky case began, where the Udmurts were accused of the ritual killing of the Russian peasant Konan Matyunin. The investigation revolved around one idea: the Votyaks supposedly sacrificed him to their gods. The case involved huts, cups, and an allegedly blood-stained kaftan. Prosecutor Raevsky spoke about a certain terrifying ritual. A chosen person is lured into the village, kept locked up, then taken to the family hut, hanged, beheaded, the heart is cut out, and the organs are burned on a bonfire. He spoke confidently and passionately as if he had witnessed it himself. The story made an impression on the peasant jurors from neighboring villages. 7 out of the 11 defendants were found guilty. They were sentenced to hard labor and exile, and only the 3 most inconspicuous were acquitted. The prosecution seemed to have won at first glance, but the whole case was falling apart at the seams from the very beginning. The prosecution's version was based not on facts, but on rumors. None of the witnesses saw the attack, and all the evidence was circumstantial. The only thing that even remotely connected the arrested men to the case was some old village crockery, which the police decided had been used to store human blood. Although the examination showed that the blood could have been from a bird, or in some cases it was just juice from berries, the defenders did not give up. Lawyer Dragin filed an appeal to the Senate. The complaint turned out to be convincing, and the Senate recognized that the case had been conducted with violations. The accusations were based on assumptions, and everything was sent for review to another court in another city. The second trial began, this time in Yelabuga. The same people, the same accusations, once again stories about shamans, the evil god Kurbona who demands human hearts, once again the evidence, bowls with dried stains, and a witness who heard something 10 years ago from a drunken vagabond. Once again a verdict, once again 7 people were found guilty, once again hard labor, but the defense did not give up. The third hearing took place in May 1896. That's when everything started to go differently. The lawyers Dryagin and Korobchevsky brought not ritual legends to the courtroom, but dry facts. One of the experts, the ethnographer Vereshchagin, stated directly that the Udmurts never had a tradition of human sacrifice, not even in the most ancient rituals. No such cases reported. The lawyer Korobchevsky went to Multan himself and found that very hut. He showed that the structure was too low. Not even one adult man could fit in there, let alone drag someone inside, swing an axe, burn organs, and perform a ritual. And no one at the trial could explain how bodies could even be brought into that hut. Everything seemed far-fetched, and no one really examined the place where the body was found. The wood chips with blood that the peasants showed to the bailiff, he irritably threw into the swamp, and the logs on the path, supposedly soaked with blood too. No one checked anything. Everything that didn't fit the already prepared version was simply dismissed. Bailiff Timofeev, the very one who was the first to handle the case, found himself in an awkward position. It turned out he was inside the hut himself, saw the place, but didn't mention it in the official documents. He never explained why. Maybe he didn't think it was necessary, or maybe he didn't want to ruin a beautiful legend. The witness's testimony was inconsistent. Confessions were obtained under pressure, and the evidence turned out to be meaningless. In the end, it became clear that no one was caught red-handed. The whole case was built on fantasies and rumors. And on June 4, 1896, the court delivered a verdict of not guilty. All charges, both of murder and of ritual, were found to be groundless, and the accused were released. It was a sensation. The press exploded. Journalists, writers, lawyers, dozens of people followed the trial and did not hide their opinions. Viktor Korolenko, a writer and publicist, became almost the voice of the defense with his articles. They exposed the accusation's absurdity. Lawyer Konin called the case a disgrace to the investigation. Thus ended a 3-year persecution. People nearly faced hard labor for taking a life that may never have been lost. And even if it was, it definitely wasn't in the hut, and definitely not for an evil god. It turned out to be not a ritual, but ordinary human hatred and a hunt for those who were different from the majority. When this whole story with the sacrifice began, the investigation quickly decided that a terrible, barbaric thing was to blame for everything. They were accused of witchcraft, of worshipping some evil god Kurbon, who supposedly needed human hearts as offerings. This idea seemed convincing only on paper, but those who really knew the Udmurts immediately understood it was nonsense. In reality, most of the residents of Stari Multan had long been baptized. There was an Orthodox church in the village, services were held, children were baptized, people confessed, and Orthodoxy was a part of everyday village life. As in any Russian village, even the head of the local church was from the same Udmurts who were accused of the crime. The priest who served in Multan even before the arrests insisted that there had never been any ritual killings in the village. If anything like that had happened, he would have known. The peasants came to him for confession and shared their troubles. There wasn't even a hint that anyone was killing people anywhere in honor of pagan gods. Yes, the Udmurts really did retain some old customs. For example, they would gather in family huts, small wooden structures, where they sometimes lit candles or sacrificed birds. During holidays it was customary to prepare meat, which was shared with the villagers, and a portion was donated to the church. These very celebrations, with dishes made from birds and beef, were called sacrifices, and this was no secret. Nothing happened in these huts that went beyond village superstition. Some would remember their ancestors, some would ask for health, sometimes they'd leave a piece of bread, pour some milk, whisper something in their own language. But it's all in the same vein as the Russian habit of leaving a candy on a grave. No blood or sacrifices, only remembrance. Lawyer Korobchevsky and writer Korolenko both said there was nothing terrible in those huts. Even during thorough searches, the police didn't find any knives, no ritual instruments, nothing frightening, just old dishes with stains from chicken or berries. But the investigation ignored that, preferring to believe in the savagery of paganism. The convicted responded to the first guilty verdict by saying, "Christ suffered, and we must suffer too." The people spent almost 3 years under arrest. The oldest suspect died even before the first trial, and another elderly accused man died almost immediately after being released. Already after the acquittal, the main piece of evidence was found. As soon as the swamp dried up a bit, 2 local peasants went to gather moss and stumbled upon a head in the dried up bog. It appeared literally a few steps away from where the body was found, in the very same swamp where, apparently, it was cut off but not taken away. This fact made all suspicions collapse completely. If the head wasn't taken for a ritual, then it all comes down to plain cruelty because of a conflict between the peasants. It would seem that the discovered head should have made the police continue the investigation, since the culprits were not found, but something went wrong. Prestav Timofeev, despite the discovery, stated there are no grounds and no reasons, and the case was hushed up. Meanwhile, a picture of the crime emerged. All the evidence pointed to the real culprits. two Russian peasants from a neighboring village who had asked to move to the Udmurts' better lands but were refused, and they held a grudge. They hoped that after a big scandal, the Udmurts would be sent to penal servitude from their fertile fields, and then the peasants from neighboring villages could take their land. Professor of forensic medicine Feodosy Patenko soon confirmed that the killing was not a ritual, but an imitation of a ritual out of revenge for refusing to accept them into the community and give them a piece of land. But the real names of the culprits, Timofey Vasyukin and Yakov Koneshin, were only discovered 3 decades later. One of them confessed during confession. So, what did the real story look like? Matyunin was deprived of his life not because of a sacrifice, but because of a land dispute. The body was dumped on the molten side, and the head was thrown into the swamp. It looked like a riddle to frame others. Voices of truth rose too late, when the whole show was already over, and yet the truth still came out. More than 3 years after the life was taken, when the swamp loosened its grip, people found the head. All without legends, without rituals, without mysticism, without ancient gods, just a taking of life out of malice and envy, and repentance in confession before death. The court acquitted the peasants of Stary Multan, but they paid a huge price. Write what you think about this case. Leave likes or dislikes and watch other videos on the channel. They come out even though you don't always get notifications about it.